Hi everyone, so some new research has recently been published and the mainstream media has also been reporting on it, and a lot of people have actually sent me this article asking for my opinion on it. Vegans and vegetarians may have a higher stroke risk, and I'm sure after reading that a lot of meat eaters have been saying,
Haha, you vegans always talk about how you're so much healthier, got lower rates of heart disease, a diabetes, a cancer. Well, guess what, vegans? There's a new study out that shows that you have a higher risk of getting a stroke than me. So, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go out and eat a double bacon cheeseburger, cause I care about my health. I don't want to drop dead of a stroke like you vegans.
and I've seen a lot of vegans online wondering, like, hey, is the study just complete bullcrap? Is this bad journalism? Are they misinterpreting the findings of the study? Well, I'd say no. I'd say this is pretty good, fair, balanced journalism, and I wouldn't say the study itself is bad. It just has a few drawbacks, and we'll touch on that a bit later. So we're going to go through this BBC article and the study itself, talk about some of the findings, why they might have had some of those findings, and we'll talk about some of the drawbacks of the study itself, and talk about what conclusions we can make. So from the article, people who eat vegan and vegetarian diets have a lower risk of heart disease and a higher risk of stroke, a major study suggests. They had 10 fewer cases of heart disease and 3 more strokes per 1,000 people compared with meat eaters. And again, I don't think this article is biased in any way towards meat eating. I think this is good journalism. They did fairly report that, hey, in the study, the meat eaters did have a much higher absolute risk of heart disease, but the vegans and vegetarians in the study did have a higher absolute risk of stroke, and I think that's what's throwing a lot of people off. It's a bit perplexing seeing that, obviously vegans and vegetarian diets are much more heart healthy, so why are we seeing vegans and vegetarians having a higher stroke risk? And we'll get into that a bit later. So does this show that vegan and vegetarian diets are unhealthy? Dr. Frankie Phillips from the British Dietetic Association says not, because this was an observational study. They looked at what people ate and followed them for years, so it's an association, not cause and effect, she says. And I'm really glad that this article pointed out this limitation with the research. So this was a prospective cohort study, which means they found different groups of people following different diets, and they followed them over a long period of time to see if there are any differences in major health outcomes between these diet groups. So what that means is we can't really draw any strong conclusions from the set of data. These are only population trends, and especially since the study didn't actually track nutrient intake or status among the study participants, there's no way to determine whether or not this is an inherent risk with vegan or vegetarian diets, and they weren't able to establish any kind of cause and effect relationship with these dietary patterns and risk of disease. And the authors actually noted this in their paper, that in future studies they need to look at nutrient intake, nutrient status, and whether or not there's any association between certain nutrients and risk of disease or death. And this article also points out another really important thing. Has what people eat changed since the study started? Researchers did go back to participants in 2010 to ask them again about their diets, but Dr. Phillips says vegan and vegetarian diets will have changed. This is data that's being collected from a couple of decades ago, she says. It might well be that the typical vegetarian diet today looks very different to a vegetarian or vegan diet from 20 or 30 years ago. The range of vegetarian and vegan convenience foods has escalated massively. It's a lot more mainstream. So again, they're just pointing out some more inherent flaws with this prospective cohort design. The study had 18 years of follow-up, and I'm sure within those 18 years, the study participants' diets would have changed, especially for the vegan and vegetarian diet groups. Like they noted in this article, there's a lot more vegan and vegetarian convenience foods, and that doesn't mean all the changes were negative. I'm sure there would have been some positive dietary changes. There's definitely more fortified foods, more widespread use of supplementation for vegans and vegetarians. but the study didn't track nutrient intake or status in these diet groups. So the study has no way of determining whether or not the increased risk of stroke in this population is an inherent risk for a vegan or vegetarian diet, nor were they able to find any association between certain nutrients and stroke risk. So for future research, randomized trials would be ideal, where you have a lot more control over the study participants' diets, you have a lot more data to go on, and that way you can establish actual cause and effect relationships between certain dietary patterns and risk of disease, including stroke risk. But at the very least, for future prospective cohorts, they should track nutrient intake and status among these diet groups so that they can at least establish some associations between certain foods, certain nutrients, and risk of disease. And now on to the actual study. Here it is: risk of ischemic heart disease and stroke in meat eaters, fish eaters, and vegetarians over 18 years of follow-up, results from the prospective EPIC Oxford study. So this is open access, it's free to read. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in reading it yourself. And there are some important things to note in the abstract. So they did combine both vegetarians and vegans into one diet group, and they just called them vegetarians. And in the conclusion, they say, in this prospective cohort in the UK, fish eaters and vegetarians had lower rates of ischemic heart disease than meat eaters, although vegetarians had higher rates of hemorrhagic and total stroke. So they didn't actually mention that vegans specifically had a higher risk of total or hemorrhagic stroke. Now, because there are so few vegans in the study, they combined vegans and vegetarians as if they were one diet group in the main analysis, but the two groups were examined separately for each outcome in secondary analysis. And when the vegans were analyzed separately, the point estimates for vegans were lower for ischemic heart disease and higher for total stroke than meat eaters, but neither estimate was statistically significant because of the small number of cases in vegans, as indicated by the wide confidence intervals. So the study wasn't actually able to find a statistically significant association between vegan diets and stroke risk, and I think that is being a bit misreported here on the media. The media is claiming that both vegans and vegetarians have an increased risk of stroke, but that's not the case. In the study, they combined both the vegan and vegetarian group, and when they combined them, they had an increased risk of stroke, but on separate individual analysis, vegans didn't have an increased risk of stroke.
Oh, there you go. There you vegans go lying again. Veganism and vegetarianism is the exact same thing. You both have a mental illness, and you both love cows more than you love people.
Now, I know some people might argue that there's not much of a difference between vegan and vegetarian diets, so if vegetarians have an increased risk of stroke, then chances are vegans would also have an increased risk of stroke. Well, I don't think that's fair to assume. For one thing, vegans do have lower risks of heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer compared to vegetarians, so I don't think it's fair to just assume that vegetarians and vegans would have the same risk of disease. And secondly, I do think there is one very plausible explanation for why only vegetarians would have an increased risk of stroke. So vegetarians, of course, don't consume meat and fish. Meat and fish happens to be high in purines, and purines cause the production of uric acid. And partly for this reason, this low purine diet, vegetarians tend to have lower uric acid levels than meat eaters. But unlike vegans, vegetarians also consume cow's milk, and cow's milk is well known for lowering uric acid levels, and consequently, vegetarians also tend to have lower uric acid levels than vegans. This is significant because uric acid is an antioxidant. It protects our brains from inflammation. So if uric acid drops too low, you may have an increased risk of neurodegenerative diseases, and this could also impact the blood vessels in the brain, putting you at higher risk for stroke. And there is, in fact, research showing that low uric acid levels are associated with an increased risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, and low uric acid levels are even associated with an increased risk of stroke. So I think it's quite likely that vegans don't actually have a higher risk of stroke. It's only the vegetarians that have higher risk of stroke. For one thing, they weren't even able to find a statistically significant association between vegan diets and stroke risk. And on top of that, a vegetarian diet is unique. They're the only plant-based diet group that consumes milk, and milk is well known for lowering uric acid levels. Vegetarians on average have lower uric acid levels than both meat eaters and vegans, and low uric acid levels are associated with neurodegenerative diseases, heart disease, and stroke, and milk itself has actually been associated with neurodegenerative diseases. So I think it is quite likely that uric acid is to blame for the difference in stroke risk between these groups. In the discussion section of this paper, the authors allude to things like vitamin B12, vitamin D possibly being at play here for stroke risk. Well, in future studies, I think they should take a look at uric acid. I think that's the most that's the most likely cause for this difference in stroke risk, especially considering the widespread use of supplementation in fortified foods these days. I don't see things like B12 and vitamin D playing all that significant of a role. So I hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown of the research and you learned some things, and hopefully that answered some questions for some of you. And if you like this video, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon or through my website. I have some funding perks you may find interesting. If you're looking for clothing, then check out the Vegan Gain store. And if you're looking for online coaching, then check out Quality Gains. He offers customized online coaching programs, and you can get 10% off by using the discount code VG10. And as always, keep making those vegan gains.
Beef. What a relief. When will this poisonous product cease? This is another public service announcement. You can believe it or you can doubt it. Let us begin now with the cow. The way it gets to your plate and how